Are you
So,
familiar with the work of Dean Simonton? Do you know who
oh
that
yeah,
is?
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so maybe you could talk about this because one of the things that I love about Dean's work is as a very committed evolutionist. One of the things that I did in several of my books, but most notably in my first book, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, is I tried to demonstrate the number of disparate fields and phenomena that one could study in a different way, in a complementary way, in an additional way, by infusing it with an evolutionary lens. And so, in the pursuit of that research, I came across the field of Darwinian creativity.
Right. Sure. Sure.
So
Yeah.
maybe you want to talk about this because I think that's a fantastic book. I love it.
Oh yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that like the basic idea of Darwinian creativity was put forth most succinctly by Karl Popper, who suggested that the purpose of thinking is so that our ideas can die instead of us. And so, the Popperian notion, and I think it's well substantiated by the relevant neurobiology, is that so the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible, at least in part, for the generation of creative ideas, especially abstract ideas, developed over time as an extension of the motor cortex. So you might say if you only have a motor cortex, then you only can act things out. But if you have a prefrontal cortex, then you can imagine acting things out in a fictional world. You can evaluate the consequences of acting them out, and then you can decide whether or not going ahead and implementing the action would be a good idea. And that's actually part of what we think of as thinking. Like when a child says to his sister, "You better not do that, or dad, or you'll get in trouble with dad." Basically, what the child has done is constructed a fictional imagistic avatar, run it in a simulated world, evaluated the consequences, and decided that implementing that strategy would be a bad idea, right? And that's what the prefrontal cortex does. And so Popper's notion, which has been shared by a lot of people who've thought about the evolution of thought, is that the typical animal, like a mosquito, let's say, has to produce a million different mosquitoes so that one of them gets to survive. Whereas a human being can produce a million different ideas within the same human being, kill off all the bad ones, and then manifest the good ones. And so we've actually figured out how to mimic the process of natural selection fictionally, which is, of course, even what you're doing when you go watch a movie, because what you do is you watch an avatar, a collective avatar, act out a strategy and then evaluate whether the consequences were good or bad. Either way, it's instructive. And so we do that all that we love doing that.
I would add to Popper maybe a more direct evolutionary link to this topic that we're discussing would be Donald Campbell with his evolutionary epistemology, because he actually modeled knowledge, right? It's evolutionary epistemology. And he uses the language of natural selection, right? There's a selection process, there's variation, there's mutation of ideas. So all of the inherent mechanisms of evolutionary theory, he applies them to epistemology. So for the viewers who might be interested in this, Donald Campbell, and actually you and I earlier mentioned something that people might not know when we discussed convergent validity. This also stems from Campbell and Fisk's a brilliant idea of the multi-trait, multi-method matrix, where when you're trying to validate whether a construct is truly doing what it's supposed to do, you have to kind of check off a whole bunch of validities. So Donald Campbell is truly an intellectual giant, and I guess many people... You would agree with that assessment, obviously.
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, then with regards to that multi-trait, multi-method matrix notion, that's a complicated one, because the notion is that you want to use separate measurement techniques to assess the same phenomena to see if you get the same report. And of course, the difficulty then is, how do you determine whether or not your measurement techniques are actually different? Because they can be technologically different, but embedded in the same theoretical framework. And so that makes their separateness of dubious validity. But I think that doesn't undermine the fundamental point. And I think the best example of that actually is the use of our senses to orient ourselves in the world. Because while sight obviously relies on the electromagnetic spectrum, and then audition relies on what differential in air pressure, and then touch is well, that's actually the sense, the felt sense of the forces that are governing the external, the outside of molecules, which is what makes something solid. And then smell seems to be a direct assessment of the molecular structure of a substance. And so these, you can think of these as really they're usually quite distinct channels to triangulate. It's actually quadrangulate, but to get a handle on the world. And the idea is the more of your senses that a given phenomena activate simultaneously in a correlated manner, the more you can be certain that something actually is there. And then what the scientific method does is say, yeah, well, that's true for one person. But then if you take 10 people and you run them through the standard procedure and all 10 report the same thing, you can even be more certain that that thing exists. And so the multi-trait, multi-method approach to validation is actually a direct analog of what our senses do when we come into encounter with the world, especially when you also think about our senses as being extended by the capacity for communication and criticism. And so, which is also why it's so absurd to think about the scientific method as nothing but about the socio-cultural construct of phallogocentric oppressors, putting their jackboots on the throat of the world.